What does victory look like when the people you've come to save are too weak to celebrate? It's May 1945, and Staff Sergeant William Cooper's unit rumbles into the Dutch town of Wageningen, jeeps rattling, boots stamping, the long war still ringing in their bones. They expect a hero's welcome, cheers, waving flags, kids clambering on bumpers. They expect relief and noise, and relief made visible. Instead, they drive up a main street waiting for that moment of release, scanning doorways and windows for joy, convinced the celebration is just around the corner. They rode in expecting a party, flags snapping, cheers spilling into the street, people pressing forward to touch the liberators. Instead, the jeep rolled through a silence so complete it felt deliberate. No bands, no banners, no laughter. Men craned their necks, scanning doorways and windows for faces, for the kind of welcome they'd imagined. All they found were empty thresholds, shuttered homes, and the slow, careful tread of a town that had learned to stop making noise. Their boots clicked on cobbles like a metronome, and a cold, awkward hush settled over the unit, an uneasy pause, as if the place itself were holding its breath. They wait for cheers, but instead, thin shapes slip from doorways like smoke, not waving flags or laughter, but faces drawn to bone, eyes too large and hollow, clothing hanging in tatters, hands twitch, shoulders fold under invisible weight. Movement is slow, as if the town is walking on borrowed time. The air feels thick, like someone has muted color and sound. A child pauses on a stoop. A woman grips a basket that once held bread but now holds nothing. And an old man leans on a cane that seems to do most of his standing for him. The soldiers fall silent, the expected celebration curdling into something much darker. Cooper and his men exchange confused, disturbed glances. They had pictured flags and cheers. Instead, there is a silence that presses on the chest like cold fog. The streets feel emptied of life, yet full of presence. Ghostly shapes at thresholds, hollow faces turning slowly, eyes too large and glassy. Their uniforms hang from skin that shouldn't belong to people. For a moment, the soldiers can only stand and watch, trying to reconcile training and expectation with this haunted hush. It isn't liberation. It feels like trespassing on a city's grief. Then, almost imperceptibly, something moves toward them, a tiny, determined figure. Then, from the doorway, a little girl no older than 7 peels away from the silent crowd and walks toward Cooper's jeep. Each step is a small, stubborn act of will, feet bare, coat hanging from thin shoulders, ribs visible beneath gray skin. She doesn't hurry, she doesn't wave. Her face is a map of hunger. Cheeks hollow, wide, desperate eyes fixed on him as if he were the shore after a long storm. Around her, the town seems to hold its breath. Soldiers glance at one another, hands hovering near rifles. For a moment, everything narrows to that frail, determined figure coming closer. Stunned, Cooper instinctively reaches into his pack and pulls out a single chocolate bar, an everyday thing in another life, suddenly absurdly precious here. He peels back the crinkled wrapper with fingers that still feel like a soldier's, then holds it out, palm steady but heart pounding. For a moment, the war training and the maps and orders fall away. This small square of sugar is a lifeline. He offers it to her across the hush, a quiet, almost shameful generosity, an offering into the abyss of her hunger. The girl reaches out on a trembling hand, fingers thin as twigs, and takes the chocolate as if it were an offered lifeline. She cradles the wrapper like a relic, eyes enormous and wet, gratitude compressing her whole face into something small and raw. For a long, suspended second, she studies it. No playful delight, no casual hunger, but a kind of awe usually reserved for miracles. The tiny bar glows in her palms. The world narrows to cocoa and paper and the soldier who dared to give. Around them, soldiers hold their breath. Something sacred and fragile has just arrived. She takes the first, slow bite, and for a beat, nothing happens. Then the careful armor of bravery collapses. Her shoulders sag. Tears cut clean tracks through the dirt on her face. Relief rushes in so it shocks. Then pain follows, old and deep, a hollowing that no candy can fill. She clutches the wrapper like a talisman, makes a small, broken sound that is part sob, part laugh, and looks up with eyes that have seen too much. Around them, the men go still. Even the air seems to hold its breath. In that instant, Cooper knows this isn't a celebration. He had walked into what he thought would be a victory parade. Instead, one trembling bite from a small, filthy hand cracked everything he believed. The girl's cry, half relief, half a lifetime of pain, lands like a blow. Cooper's training, his maps, his tidy reports about supply lines and enemy movements all feel useless in that instant. This isn't the messy aftermath of combat. It's arithmetic turned to cruelty. These people haven't merely suffered under occupation. Someone turned hunger into a weapon. The image of that child with the chocolate makes the war look less like strategy and more like something far more deliberate and far worse. The silence snapped into a terrible clarity. This wasn't famine by chance. It was the end of the Hongerwinter, and it had been manufactured. Whole neighborhoods had been starved as a tool, a calculated policy of humiliation and punishment, not the collateral damage of war. Cooper's hand went numb holding that chocolate. What he felt was more than pity. It was outrage. Faces gaunt from months of deprivation were the fingerprints of an occupier's decision. In that instant, the soldiers understood the crime beneath their boots. People had been weaponized, their hunger turned into strategy. Liberation suddenly meant undoing an atrocity, not just raising a flag. To understand the silence, you need the why. 7 months earlier, in the fall of 1944, the Dutch government in exile in London made a brutal, almost impossible request: a nationwide railway strike. The logic was cold and simple: stop the trains, choke German logistics, and help the Allied advance. It wasn't abstract politics, it was a call for collective sacrifice. Workers, railwaymen, and ordinary citizens answered, laying down tools and lives in the hope of hastening liberation. They hoped the delay would shorten the war. Nobody imagined how quickly occupation would turn that courageous choice into a weapon against the very people it was meant to save. 7 months after the government in exile called for a nationwide railway strike to slow the German war machine, the Dutch answered with quiet courage. Workers, farmers, families, all refusing to move the rails. The German response was swift and merciless. In retaliation, they imposed a total food embargo on the Western Netherlands, sealing off ports, rails, and roads, and cutting 4.5 million people off from all supplies. An act of resistance had been met with collective punishment. Ordinary civilians were turned into prisoners of policy. Their basic right to food made a bargaining chip in a war they hadn't chosen. As the coldest winter in years closed in, the people of the Western Netherlands stopped being civilians and became prisoners, trapped not by walls but by hunger. What looked like weather was actually policy. Supply lines choked, railways halted, checkpoints sealed, and a deliberate embargo turned starvation into an instrument of war. Bread lines thinned to ghosts, doorways held breath like smoke, and hollow faces peered out of frosted windows. It wasn't random suffering, it was calculated. Starvation was weaponized. Families learned to ration hope. For a while, they tightened belts and burned furniture to survive. Small, desperate measures that would soon prove heartbreakingly insufficient. At first, it was manageable. Belts were tightened, rations shrank. Families counted calories like daylight, pushing small comforts aside and stretching one loaf into a dozen thin meals. Neighbors traded preserves. Mothers clipped coupons and folded portions so children might sleep with a stomach that felt half full. But by late 1944, those small reserves, basement jars, hidden tins, the last bag of flour were gone. What had been endurance became erosion. Quiet coping turned into grim arithmetic. Who would get the last bite? Where to find firewood in a frozen city? The true desperation had arrived. They burned their chairs, their tables, the beds that once held families, piece by piece, for one last flicker of warmth. A woman sawed through a rocking chair while her child shivered in thin cloth. Beloved dogs and cats, part of the household, were killed and boiled for a sliver of meat. Markets emptied overnight. Cupboards were mirrors of each other, hollow. Checkpoints turned neighborhoods into islands. Trucks stopped coming. People traded heirlooms, jewelry, anything for a taste of bread. Lines formed where nothing was left to buy. And when Dutch leaders cried for relief, the occupiers answered with a closed border and silence. As families burned their furniture for a little heat and killed pets for a scrap of meat, desperate voices rose beyond the Dutch borders. Governments, charities, even the Red Cross, pleading to send food, blankets, medicine. Each appeal was met the same way, a hard, calculated refusal. German commanders sealed roads, shut down railways, denied permits, and wrapped every request in security pretexts until aid convoys simply couldn't get through. It wasn't chaos, it was policy. The world might have known, but the occupiers chose cruelty over mercy. The result was absolute and terrifying. There would be no relief. By early 1945, the social fabric simply unraveled. Neighborhoods that once hummed with life fell silent, and the death rate climbed faster than anyone could tend to. Desperation stopped being an abstract word and became a daily, private ritual. Parents watching their children hollow out before them, counting calories like a cruel arithmetic of survival. When food ran out, dignity followed. Families boiled tulip bulbs, a toxic, bitter substitute that burned and only prolonged the suffering because there was nothing else to put in a pot. It was a slow, communal collapse, a people reduced to scavenging for scraps as hope thinned to a whisper. When even boiling tulip bulbs stopped staving off hunger, people began to scavenge for anything that might keep a child alive. They picked through barns, begged leftovers from farms, and, if luck, shame, or desperation allowed, fed their children cattle feed, crushed and boiled until it was barely edible. Classrooms became waiting rooms. Tiny bodies sat at desks with heads bowed, eyes glassy. Lessons fell away as children grew too weak to learn, and sometimes simply fainted where they sat. It was a world reduced to one question: how to keep a small pair of lungs breathing until morning, until help arrived. In the hushed classrooms, where chalkboards stood cold and desks sat half empty, teachers did the unthinkable. They ate less so their pupils might eat at all. They folded the day's thin slice of bread into secret pockets, smuggled scraps under coats, and slipped a sugar cube or a spoonful of porridge to the smallest, shivering child when no one was looking. They spoke softly, redistributed rations like furtive prayers, and kept count of who had already been spared another night. It was a quiet, relentless kindness, one that bought a few more breaths, and the kind of sacrifice doctors would later try to document, though paper could never hold its full weight. Teachers had been sneaking scraps to their weakest pupils, stealing from themselves just to keep a child awake for another hour of class. But even those quiet saviors could not stop the slow collapse. Dr. Henrik Mulder walked those same ruined classrooms and hospital wards, a physician turned witness, and he wrote it down with a kind of furious gentleness. He saw children whose bodies had been hollowed out by months of hunger, limbs too thin, faces drained of color, eyes that had already gone somewhere far beyond the room. There was nothing left to cure. All he could offer was a steady hand, a soft word, and comfort in their last moments. The psychological toll was immense. Parents watched their children weaken day by day, measuring breaths instead of years, counting crumbs instead of seasons. Every dawn became an exercise in impossible arithmetic. Who gets the last crust? Who will go to bed hungry tonight? Mothers softened their faces and lied about their own hunger to stop a child's cry. Fathers pawned keepsakes for a scrap of meat. Siblings secretly hid tiny portions so the smallest might sleep. Those choices were private, brutal, and endless. The town's silence was not peace, but the sound of moral collapse. And while families made these desperate calculations in freezing rooms, others, far away, were wrestling with a different, colder kind of decision. Allied commanders weren't blind to the reports. They arrived like cold, clinical dispatches, numbers and maps that hinted at something far worse than supply shortages. But in the planning rooms, the crisis became a problem of calculus, not simply compassion. Liberate the Western Netherlands now and risk slowing the final push into Germany, possibly prolonging the war and costing more lives. Push on and accept that thousands, perhaps millions, would keep dying under a cruel embargo. Could commanders justify diverting forces for one region when the stakes were the outcome of the entire war? That impossible question would haunt every choice that followed. Knowing the famine was real didn't make the choice any less brutal. Commanders had to weigh territory, timetables, and lives on a ledger that smelled faintly of calculus and fear. Pull forces to smash the German lines in the west, and you slow the final push into Germany, potentially stretching the war, costing thousands more lives. Hold back to save a region, and you condemn millions to starvation in the meantime. It was a moral knot with no clean solution, a cold arithmetic that gnawed at field commanders and politicians alike. Out of that awful compromise came a partial answer from the air. War has its own brutal arithmetic. Move fast, end the fighting, save more lives. That cold logic ruled the Allied minds. But reports of whole towns being starved into ghosts forced an impossible choice. Slow the push into Germany to save a region, or try to feed people from the sky and keep pressing on. The answer was a painful compromise. In late April, under carefully negotiated ceasefires, the Allies opened humanitarian air corridors. Operation Manna and Operation Chowhound began. Low, precise missions sending pallets of food down into fields and streets. A fragile mercy born of both strategy and conscience. RAF and USAF planes flew low, their silhouettes cutting across the gray April sky, as if pointing toward hope. They opened their bays and crates tumbled out, bobbing on fragile white canopies. Tins and sacks drifting down into frozen streets and barren fields. People stopped whatever small, desperate task they were doing, heads tipped back, mouths open. Children ran, barefoot or in rags, eyes lit with a shocked, fragile joy. For those on the ground, those falling parcels felt like mercy dropped from heaven, the first staggering proof that someone had not forgotten them. It wouldn't be enough to erase months of starvation, but in that moment it changed everything. Planes carved the sky, and food fell like a promise. Flour, biscuits, crates of salvation tumbling into frozen fields. For a moment, people looked up with something like hope, but the supplies were only a trickle against months of deliberate starvation. The biscuits crumbled in hands too weak, the flour couldn't knit bones back together, and many crates landed beyond reach or were damaged in the drop. Malnutrition had ravaged bodies and minds. One handful of food could soothe, not heal. Those airdrops mattered. They saved lives, but they could not undo the slow, systematic violence those people had already endured. There was no other answer. Half measures and parachuted crates couldn't undo months of deliberate starvation. In early May, the Allies pushed, boots and tanks rolling where the airdrops had only whispered hope from above. Cooper's unit moved with a grim, single-minded purpose, following a thin, bloody thread of intelligence straight into the last German defenses. Wire and checkpoints that had choked the West finally gave way. When the final barrier fell, it felt less like a victory parade and more like unlocking a door on a city held at ransom. They had read the reports, briefing sheets, cold numbers about food shortages, but paper couldn't teach a man what hunger looked like up close. Walking the streets after the breakthrough, Cooper and his men felt that mismatch like a punch. Laughter was gone, clothing hung from bones, faces looked as if time had been carved out of them, and a silence sat heavier than any gunfire. The air carried a faint, sour tang of rot and wood smoke where families had burned belongings for warmth. Toys lay abandoned in the snow like small accusations. In that instant, the war's neat categories fell away. The mission had shifted into something grimmer and more urgent. Something shifted in an instant. The men who had trained to kill now found themselves trained to save. They were not arriving for parades and cheers, but stepping into a mass casualty scene. Streets that looked like hospital wards, eyes pleading where victory flags should have been. Boots that had learned to march fell silent as helmets tilted toward hollow faces. Rifles felt suddenly out of place beside tin cups and ragged blankets. Orders about flanks and objectives gave way to triage and improvisation. Who needed heat? Who needed bread? Who might still be pulled back from the edge? The mission had been rewritten, and the scale of the need was already growing. What started as one small, miraculous exchange mushrooms into something larger than any of them expected. Dozens appear at first, then hundreds. Children and parents moving forward with the same slow, pleading gait. Faces hollow, hands extended as if the world has finally remembered them. The streets fill not with cheers, but with a hush so heavy it presses on the soldiers' chests. A silence made of hunger and long, patient suffering. For a moment, there are no ranks, no orders, only bodies and need, a human tide that makes it impossibly clear. The crisis here is not a handful of hungry people, it is an entire population on the edge. They scan the gaunt faces and the empty bellies and the cold that eats through threadbare coats, and a slow, sickening clarity settles in. The tools of war, the K-rations, the field kitchens, the convoy schedules, the logistics plans, are built to move troops and ammunition, not to feed a city hollowed out by deliberate starvation. Paperwork and orders mean nothing here. Medical tents are already overflowing. Supply lines are thin and distant. Every manual, every protocol, every bureaucratic checkbox offers no immediate cure. The system cannot help these people in time. If anyone is going to fill that gap, it will have to be the soldiers standing there, right now. Then something shifted. A combat-hardened GI, no orders given, reached into his pack and tore open his K-ration like it was a private miracle. Cardboard crinkled, the tin clinked, biscuits spilled, a slab of chocolate winked up from dust. He had been saving every bite for a firefight. He looked at the hollow faces, at the little girl, and silently, without permission, offered his own food. One soldier peels back the tin and offers it to a gaunt child. A second sees his comrade's hand and does the same, then another. Very soon, hands move in a quiet chain. Boots kneel, helmets tilt, jackets unzip to reveal more cans, biscuits, chocolate. No orders, no logistics, just an instinct. The small, private act spreads like wildfire through the ranks, until the front line feels less like a battlefield and more like a long, ragged passing of food from one human to another. Then something else happens, something no one planned for. One soldier rips open his K-ration and hands a tin to a child. Another follows. Orders and timetables blur. Paperwork and supply schedules mean nothing against the hollow eyes on the street. Men who have been trained to hold lines and take objectives begin to pass cans, break crusts, trade salutes for spoons. It's chaotic. It's quiet. It's unanimous. In that instant, the mission shifts, not from combat to conquest, but from strategy to mercy. And every rule that once mattered is set aside for the single urgent work of saving a life. The sight of those hollow-eyed children changes everything. Orders, timetables, supply manifests, none of it matters when a small hand reaches out, trembling. Faces that have only known survival look up with a need so immediate and raw it obliterates strategy. Men who chased objectives across Europe feel their mouths go dry and their packs suddenly heavy with responsibility. One by one, they strip their own rations, open tins, tear wrappers, hand over the last comforts they were supposed to keep. It's not heroic in the way the books describe. It's messy, urgent, intimate. Soldiers giving the last of themselves because nothing else could be called victory in that moment. Captain Thomas Morrison stood in the doorway of a ruined house and watched the town unfold in slow motion. People emerging from doorways, from cellars, from the shadow of ruined storefronts, each pair of hands reaching for a scrap of bread or a dented can of stew. There were no cheers, only the small, wrenching sounds of people breaking, low sobs, choked whispers, knees giving out as relief and exhaustion collided. Steam rose from open tins like smoke from a small miracle. Morrison felt the war tilt under his feet. The uniforms meant nothing here. What filled the street was not victory, but a raw, communal grief and gratitude, wordless and absolute. In that moment, the act of giving and receiving food became the day's entire emotional event. Not parades or speeches, but tin cans and stale bread passed from rough, gloved hands into the trembling palms of children and mothers. Each exchange like a quiet sacrament. The clink of lids, the soft rustle of paper, the sudden intake of breath as someone finally swallowed without fear. Soldiers who'd been trained to take now offered. Faces hardened by combat softened into something like prayer. Tears replaced cheers. It was a communion of shared humanity that redefined what liberation meant, searing itself into memory far more than any victory flag. For these American soldiers, it becomes a different kind of fight, not clearing houses or taking bridges, but keeping hollow bodies alive. They cobble together stoves from helmets and fuel from tins, string up pots and ladles, and stand over boiling kettles for hours on end. Men who once measured time in patrols now measure it in ladles and portions, passing out thin stews, hot broth, anything warm. They work in shifts, sleep in doorways, whispering recipes they barely remember. Each bowl served is both triage and a promise, we won't leave you hungry. In that kitchen smoke, the war's meaning quietly shifts. Many soldiers would later say feeding those starving children was the single most meaningful thing they did in the entire war. Not a medal, not a city captured, that memory outshone them all. They remembered faces lit by a single piece of bread, the tiny, stunned thank yous, the way a grease-stained hand felt more like a lifeline than a weapon. Back home, in letters and reunions, veterans pointed to those nights of improvised kitchens and endless ladling of stew as the moment the war stopped being a map and became painfully, beautifully human. It stayed with them. It changed how they measured victory. In an instant, their long, brutal struggle across Europe found a purpose no battle plan could provide. They had measured success in objectives and lines taken. Now, success was a steaming bowl in a child's hands, a can shared between strangers. The act of feeding rewired what victory meant. Not flags or trophies, but lives saved and dignity returned. It wasn't sentimental, it was practical compassion, raw and immediate, and it gave the men something no debrief could record: the knowledge that, amid destruction, they had chosen to be caretakers, not conquerors, and in doing so, began to close the distance between soldier and civilian. An immediate, almost electric bond forms between the men in uniform and the hollow-eyed townspeople, a connection born not from flags or speeches, but from the simple, radical act of sharing food. Eyes meet, hands touch, and everything a soldier thought victory meant narrows to this intimate exchange. Shared democratic values give the moment meaning, but it's the universal language of compassion, offering, receiving, holding each other's dignity, that cements it. Laughter is fragile, gratitude sharper. Names are traded, stories start. Small rituals grow. A loaf passed, a cup poured, a child guided by a gentle hand. Until the children, curious and grateful, begin to trail the soldiers, testing English words like new toys. Children began to trail behind the soldiers like a slow, hopeful parade. Small feet shuffling, heads tilted, voices barely above a whisper as they practiced clumsy English. "Hello, thank you," repeated with a careful pride. Soldiers who had trained for battle found themselves teaching songs and simple words between shifts. Pockets of gum traded for crooked smiles, names exchanged awkwardly and treasured. A tentative game of catch, a soldier's hand on a trembling shoulder, laughter that sounded almost like a miracle. These were the quiet moments that stitched two worlds together. Those fragile friendships would outlast ration cards and front lines, a human bridge that helped the town begin to heal. The road to physical recovery is long. Allied medical teams pushed through the rubble and set up makeshift clinics in school gyms and church halls, dirty cots in rows, white-coated doctors and nurses sorting who needs immediate care, who can wait, who needs slow, careful feeding. These were not quick fixes. Months of skilled attention lay ahead. IVs for dehydration, antibiotics for infections, vitamin therapy, gentle calorie increases to avoid deadly refeeding complications, and hands-on physical therapy to rebuild wasted muscles. For the children, food was only the first step. Healing meant patience, medical know-how, and a steady stream of caregivers who would not let them slip away. It took months of careful nutritional therapy to pull those children back from the edge. No quick fixes, no triumphal montage. Doctors measured calories like lifelines, starting with thin, frequent feeds to avoid refeeding syndrome, coaxing appetite with warm broths and milk, treating infections and broken teeth, watching weight creep up gram by gram. Nurses learned each child's tiny preferences, turning feeding into comfort. Physical therapy rebuilt weak limbs. Vitamins healed bruised bodies. Progress was painfully slow. A brighter eye here, a steadier step there. Over weeks and months, the hollow faces filled out, and the damage of the Hongerwinter began, at last, to reverse. The psychological healing, the doctors warned, would outlast the physical. Months of careful feeding patched ribs and restored weight, but restoring a child's sense of safety took years. Reopening schools wasn't just an administrative step, it was a deliberate act of repair. Desks brought back, chalk on boards, teachers returning with trembling hands to coax tiny routines, to teach letters and the basic trust of being seen and held. Play became therapy, simple games, a swing creaking again, a whispered secret between friends, each laugh a small, brave reclaiming of childhood. The scars remained, but step by patient step, normalcy returned. In the end, the liberation of the Netherlands wasn't told as a roll of tanks and flags. It wasn't a conquest measured in miles or enemy positions. It was a story of survival, of villages kept alive by handfuls of food, of soldiers who traded orders for compassion, of tiny hands trembling around a chocolate bar. Those quiet acts, Shared rations, makeshift kitchens, nurses bending over beds became the real victory. They stitched broken bodies back together, and they mended something harder: trust. For both sides, the war's meaning shifted. Victory stopped being about defeating an enemy and became about affirming our shared humanity. When survivors close their eyes, they don't remember tanks or victory parades. They remember a soldier crouched on a curb, a dented tin in his hand, offering a spoonful of stew to a skeletal child. They remember the tremble in the child's fingers, the soldier's weathered hand steadying the bowl, the first breath of hot food like a small miracle. That quiet human exchange, more than any flag or trumpet, became the emblem of liberation, proof that what saved them was not just force, but compassion. Decades later, that single image still holds the shape of what freedom truly felt like. In the end, victory wasn't the roar of tanks or the raising of a flag. It was a lineup of gaunt children reaching for a can of stew, and a handful of soldiers ripping open their own rations to give it to them. That choice, small, immediate, human, reframed everything. Winning meant saving people, not just territory. For those men, the war's meaning shifted in an instant. The greatest weapon they carried that day wasn't firepower. It was compassion handed over a makeshift table. If this story moved you, share it. Honor the quiet courage that redefined what victory truly looks like.